Thank you very much. I'm Vice Admiral, retired Ignacio Mardones from the Chilean Navy. Also, I'm the head of strategy of Athena Lab. And my first word must to say thank you very much, Bruce, for inviting us. It's really an honor and a privilege for Athena Lab to be part of this very important conference here in London. So we came here with a team, Juan Pablo Toro from Chile, our director, executive director, and other people that are head of department are here with us. So again, for Athena Lab, thank you very much. And thank you for our panelists. I hope we have an excellent conversation, excellent discussion this morning. So first, I would like if you can introduce yourself and also explain to the audience what is your job and what is your institution. Victoria?
Great. Thanks very much for inviting me to speak at this panel with such esteemed speakers. My name is Victoria Bird Ruiz-Benitez Lugo. I sit in the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. But I work in OCSM, which stands for the Office for Conflict Stabilisation and Mediation. This was previously the Stabilisation Unit, which was a cross-government department, and is now a department embedded in the Foreign Office. We work on kind of leading conflict policy across government, and work very, very closely with our kind of different government departments. Ministry of Defence, of course, Home Office, and we actually have several kind of MOD, Ministry of Defence, Army reservists embedded into the Office for Conflict and Stabilisation as a means to really ensure that kind of multidisciplinary approach to thinking through these issues of conflict, stability. We have teams covering conflict prevention, children in armed conflict, and security sector reform. And I've been kind of primarily focusing on Colombia recently, working with our ambassador and embassy out in Bogotá. And previously was an advisor advising on how to tackle serious organized crime. I was based out in Peru, covering Latin America as a whole. And yeah, great to be here today.
Thank you, Victoria. Commodore.
Good morning, Commodore Stephen Anderson. I'm a Royal Naval officer. I'm currently based in Miami with US Southern Command. The key difference, I was prior to that with the Ministry of Defense, working here covering Latin America and the Caribbean on behalf of the Ministry of Defense. And when I sat in the audience this morning, and saw before the blinds came down, looking into the fourth floor of Ministry of Defence, I started getting cold sweats again because the nightmares were coming back. So I'm glad the blinds are shut. But I've now shifted to an exchange officer. So I work for US Southern Command. I work for the US military under a memorandum of understanding that is an agreement between both nations and represent the interests of General Richardson. I work in the J5 policy, strategy and plans area, and I'm responsible for allied integration and trying to develop that, move that forward to where we go. So I'm even though I don't sound it, I'm very much American. I now know where the trash is rather than the rubbish. I know where the boot of the trunk of a car rather than the boot of a car. And the sidewalk, we struggle to look left instead of right in various areas around the footpath. So my remit as such is, and the remit of Southern Command, sorry, to be fair, there is 11 combatant commands under the US Department of Defense. 7 of those are geographical. Southern Command is one of those, so everything south of Mexico, 31 countries, including Cuba, a little cutout for the territories of Puerto Rico, and all the way down to the Antarctic. So 31 countries contained within that region and 10 territories that cover those areas. And the other global combatant commands, the geographical ones, are connected. So there's dotted lines on maps that is global, and then there's a vertical one for SpaceCom as a combatant command, and then 4 functional, so Cybercom, STRATCOM, TRANSCOM, and USSOUTHCOM, so the Special Operations Command. And the vision of General Richardson very much is working together to obtain a safe, free, prosperous Western Hemisphere, and the Western Hemisphere covers throughout. And our mission in itself is to deter aggression, to defeat threats, rapidly respond to crisis in every sense, and work closely with allies and partners in every sense of the words, and hence my role in that position. And building partner capacity and regional capacity across the area in a truly interagency approach to enhance security across the region. So that's my responsibility overall.
Thank you for this explanation, because when you say SOUTHCOM, we are continuing talking about the borders of the combat command, because sometimes countries like Chile or Peru maybe are more close to the Indo-Pac, more than Southcom. We're going to talk after that. Karen, please.
Thank you, Vice Admiral, and thank you, Rusi, for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here and to share the floor with all the colleagues. My name is Karen Meier. I'm the head of International Affairs, the MOD in Chile. My job is to advise Undersecretary of Defense and the Minister, which is Minister Fernandez right now, about international affairs. We are a team, actually, of 15 or so people. This is a division in charge of international affairs, and we work with our partners. We work actually with the UK, with the US, the SOUTHCOM, the Indo-PACOM, and also the Perry Center. But we do also, of course, work with our neighbors and the Latin American region in order to enhance international cooperation, and also we do follow, of course, the principles and all the directions of foreign policy that comes from the MFA. So that's more or less what my work is on a daily basis, but we will talk a little bit more later.
Are you a lawyer, and also you have a Master of Arts from the King's College?
Yes,
International
exactly.
Relations?
Yes, I'm a lawyer, but I've been working in international relations since I finished my graduate. So I did my master's, of course, in King's College some years ago. So it's always good and a pleasure to be back in London.
Great, thank you, Karen.
Thank you.
Doctor.
Thank you, Vice Admiral. My name is Paul Angelo. I am the director of the William J. Perry Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. And that's a very long title, but essentially what I do is I direct a team of a faculty and staff of about 40 people in providing executive education courses and developing research products focused on security and defense issues in the Western Hemisphere or the Pentagon. And in that capacity, we do a lot of cooperation with countries like Chile. Recently, we were in Chile putting on a cybersecurity seminar with the Ministry of Defense. And we work along essentially 5 lines of effort, starting with defense governance, which really has to do with the oversight and the way that civil-military relations should operate within a democratic and constitutional order, followed by human rights, transnational threats, cybersecurity, and most recently, we're developing a line of effort related to climate resiliency. I feel very much at home on this panel, so I appreciate the invitation to come to RUSI. I am a product of higher education here in the UK. Did my master's at Oxford. I did my PhD at UCL. I was actually also worked at the Ministry of Defense. I was in the NATO Policy Office as an exchange officer when I was active duty in the US Navy. I'm still a reservist in the Navy and support the US Southern Command in that capacity. And it's really great to be on a panel with 2 other people who have naval equities. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. May you talk a little bit about your previous job at the Council of the Foreign Affairs?
Prior to joining the Perry Center about a year and a half ago, I was the fellow for Latin America Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. So I am also very familiar with the think tank world, and I hold RUSI in the greatest esteem. During those 3 years, I was developing a research project that will soon be published as a book called From Peril to Partnership, U.S. Security Assistance and the Bid to Stabilize Colombia and Mexico. It's coming out through Oxford University Press next month. The e-book is already available. And in the book, I evaluate the degree to which the United States was able to facilitate security sector reform and transformation of partner militaries in Colombia and Mexico. For those of you many of you are probably familiar with Plan Colombia, which was an $8 billion investment in the security and defense forces of Colombia from 2000 to about 2011. And we saw significant transformation in terms of the effectiveness and the accountability of the Colombian security sector during that period. There was an instinct to replicate that same model in Mexico from around 2007 to about 2021. And unfortunately, that model, the Merit Initiative, underdelivered in terms of reducing the incidence of violence and crime in Mexico. And so the central question of my book is why. And if you're interested, I suggest that you read it.
Great, great. So we have 3 naval officers in the state, because Paul forget that he's retired commander of the U.S. Navy. He went to U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis. So And the other information that we are continuing this panel in Spanish, because all the people here speak Spanish. No, you speak Spanish. No, okay, I'm going to ask all of you, the first question is, how can countries in different regions effectively come together to establish multilateral defense alliance? And what are the key challenges and opportunities in fostering collaborative security initiatives to address shared regional and global threats? Victoria.
Sure. I think this morning and hopefully throughout the panel, we'll talk a lot about multilateral cooperation, transnational cooperation, international cooperation, but I think maybe it would be helpful, particularly from my perspective at least, to also talk about kind of intersectoral cooperation. So I think that there is a really important point to make here, for example, when we think about stabilization of the defense and kind of the defense community and the defense sectors in these countries in Latin America, and their coordination with civilian institutions, and that kind of civ-mil cooperation with a view to establish and implement security policies, be it on countering serious organized crime, or be it on, stabilization and armed conflict. So I think some of the challenges, some of the things that I would kind of put out there and put on the table, particularly when thinking through the kind of intersectoral cooperation in the context of Latin America. If we think about stabilization in particular, I think we have a plethora of really highly professionalized, highly efficient militaries across these countries. If we talk about Colombia, one of the most highly professionalized, effective armies in the world. And I think what can happen is when we focus and run stabilization operations, for example, the military does so incredibly quickly, incredibly efficiently, and sometimes that civilian coordination is lacking. Why? Because actually the massive civilian institutions that are required to back up the military actions are not able to move fast enough. So I think it speaks to, before we speak about kind of the multilateral and transnational cooperation, I think I'd really be interested in hearing, the panel's views and maybe continuing the conversation around that kind of intersectoral approach to tackling security issues. I think colleagues from GTOC earlier mentioned when we think about serious organized crime, again, looking at it from that kind of holistic perspective, both from a kind of developmental and aid perspective, as well as the harder edge security approaches, which again speaks to this multi-sectoral approach that is required. So yeah, I'll pause there, but I think one of the key messages for me is around civilian, military, multi-sectoral, multidisciplinary approaches that are integrated in tackling really complex, multi-dimensional security issues.
Thank you. What do you think, Commodore?
Yeah, Admiral Sir, I think, so from a pure military perspective, we are obsessed by doctrine, by policy, by strategy, by written orders in effect to go with it. So if you were to consider, there is absolutely no doubt about the importance of multilateral alliances. Very little that we do now is unilateral in any sense, and we see that on global affairs and operations worldwide and preparation for operations. So we're in a position where the importance of it is well understood within US Southern Command. And if we look at the top-down direction from Department of Defense, the integrated deterrence approach, which is very clear in the National Defense Strategy, National Military Strategy, and it's written, it's all about working together, the whole being greater than the sum of the individual parts. So therefore working in unity of effort to get after a collective end. So there is an importance to it. I think if you translate that to Latin America and the Caribbean in particular, there is, when we talk of alliances in particular, the doctrinal definition of alliances involving a treaty becomes quite difficult in many senses to get multiple nations to agree through treaties to get after a common end in many areas. So we try and adapt that as best as we can to ensure that we understand the needs of our partner nations. And from an allied perspective, what we've done within Southern Command, with the assistance of our allies, is create a framework for Western Hemisphere allied collaboration. And it's deliberately Western Hemisphere. It's not Southcom's area of responsibility, because each of the allies bring a different perspective. So UK, Canada, Netherlands, France, the majority of their global operations are done from one central location, which helps in many ways, whereas the COCOM footprint that we've discussed bring with it almost an internal US competition for resource capacity, which is improving significantly as we look at some of our consolidated strategic inputs and outputs in order to get after the global security issues that we're after. So what we're trying to do is work closely with a non-binding agreement with our allies to look at what our partners need within the nation collectively, look where our overlaps are from each nation, and all nations don't have to agree, and all 5 nations don't have to agree on what we're trying to get after. We may have some of that maybe bilateral, trilateral, or multilateral in many senses, but it needs to include the partners. We need to understand what the host nations need, and then look between us to get, to look at our efficient and effective means of being more collaborative, more coherent, and ensure that we avoid duplication of effort where necessary, because there's lots of wastage in those senses. So I think the key for us is understanding the needs of the partner nation, and then collectively working together in a multilateral process, albeit not a true treaty, to get after some of the issues that we're trying to collectively address from the security challenges.
Thank you, Commodore. That's very important to be liaison officer from UK to the Southcom to give more value to this treaty. Karen.
Yes, well, I would like to share with you some ideas in the sense of naming or trying to maybe do an interpretation of what we have right now, nowadays, in the region when we talk about defense cooperation. And my proposal is to see this in 3 different levels. First, you have numerous initiatives, and you may know that through the last decades, countries in Latin America and even in the Americas have developed many different initiatives in the political level, but we also have the strategic level, and we do have the operational or more technical level. And it is very important to maintain this 3-level view of international cooperation when we talk about defense, because finally these levels reflect the way in which the defense sector works normally. And it is important also because normally studies are more focused on the political level than in operationals or strategic levels. So what we have now, what do we have nowadays? And it's interesting to see that we have a lot of things going on. Many of them are very positive. I will highlight, for example, in the political level, what we have in the America's Defense Minister Conference, which is an hemispheric initiative, which is biannual, and is probably the most relevant arena of discussion due to its geographical extent. Not all the countries in the region are there, but mostly everyone is there, so it is very relevant. And then also, last year, it was the first South American meeting of Ministers of Foreign Affairs and Ministers of Defense. This is linked to the consensus of Brasilia.
The meeting was defense and...
Yes, it was actually a 12+12 initiative, and it was very important. This is good news because finally it is a new initiative, and what the initiative is trying to reach is that we are all together talking about defense again. And this happened in November last year. This is part of the Brazilian consensus that was also reached in May last year. So we are talking about this topic in South America again. And then I would like to highlight the importance of or the relevance of bilateral mechanisms. We have many of them. I, of course, don't want to say this is the same for every country in the region, but it is very usual to see that ministers of defense or vice ministers of defense have annual meetings, have 2+2 mechanisms every single year, and also, well, this is very relevant because finally in this type of meetings that are bilaterals, you can talk about those issues that are more specific in certain relations. But then we have, as I said before, the strategic level. And that is also very important because it is the space where we can build trust between armed forces. And this is also very strong. We have bilateral meetings, Navy-to-Navy talks, we have Army-to-Army talks, we also have Chief of Defense conversations or meetings every year. And this is a space that we need to keep, we need to protect and we need to enhance. And finally, we have the most technical or the third level that I mentioned before, which is probably the least studied level, but it's crucial daily. Because finally, this is the level in which we can avoid those small issues or small incidents that can lead us to have big problems. So what I'm referring here is, for example, all that happens in cooperation and mostly, or most importantly, coordination between countries that share borders of search and rescue areas, for example. There is exchange of information, there is exchange of alerts, and that can allow us to avoid big problems. Then we also have the CSIRTs, which are the Security Incidents Response Teams in the cyber realm. They do also have exchange of information and alerts daily. So as you can see, this is just a proposal, but I think it's again relevant to when we talk about defense cooperation, defense international cooperations, we need to look at the three levels and how they relate to each other. And this is only what we are doing inside the region, but we also have similar mechanisms with extra regional partners, as I told you before, with the US, with the UK, and many others.
Thank you. Thank you.
Right now.
Paul, what is your view from DC?
I coincide with the views of my colleagues in every instance, but I would like to pick up on a point that was made by Victoria, which relates to the interinstitutional or interagency or whole of government approaches that are needed to confront the security and defense challenges that we confront. And I think one of the major issues in the Latin America, Caribbean region is frankly that too often countries have siloed their security and defense institutions in a way that allows criminals or other adversaries to take advantage of sort of the gray lines or the gray areas between those delineations. And so we really need to start thinking of our strategies to confront the major security challenges the region that faces in an interinstitutional way. Likewise, I think one of my biggest regrets in recent years in analyzing Latin American relations or intra-regional relations is that many of the countries of the region have become so mired in their own problems that they failed to project leadership regionally and globally. Yep. And in that vein, I think the pandemic certainly caused all of our countries to look inward. The economic recession that that Latin America and the Caribbean region confronted was the most severe of any region in the world. And so certainly there were considerations and challenges that were confronted by the countries of the region that Western Europe and the United States and North America didn't confront in as acute a way. But nonetheless, I think it's time for the countries of the region to start looking to multilateralism and working across borders to confront challenges for the most part are transnational in nature. In that vein, I would also like to foot stomp the regret that I feel when I see how agnostic many countries in the region are to the collapse of a democratic consensus in the Americas. In the year 2001, all of the countries of the hemisphere, with the exception of Cuba, came together and signed the Inter-American Democratic Charter, saying that they would defend the values that underpinned democratic order and the rule of law in the Americas. And country by country, we're seeing democratic erosion and a real lack of coherent consensus response from the Americas on whether it's Venezuela, Nicaragua, El Salvador, which is another impending democratic disaster. And I think to the extent that we continue to let that happen, we're going to confront even more challenges for cooperating and coordinating amongst each other. Yeah,
but the big question is, America have a defense agreement, Rio Treaty. Do you think that is obsolete? Do you need to be replaced for another one? what happens with if you have a different political objective of in the different government?
I mean, I think the Rio Treaty, like many of the multilateral mechanisms in Latin America and the Caribbean, and by extension, the Organization of American States, have become so mired in weighing in on matters of ideology, diplomacy, and democracy, ideology, diplomacy, and politics, and instead of focusing on sort of the technocratic issues and solutions that many of the countries today desire. I think a renewed focus on things like combating disinformation, building out the technical capabilities of military forces or security forces across the region to deal with human trafficking, as was mentioned in the previous panel. These are all things that I think our multilateral organizations and institutions are equipped to rally around, but unfortunately, the Organization of American States has become an organization that is quibbling about the definition of democracy and whether or not it's worth defending, and that's a really regrettable place to be.
Karen, your opinion about the Rio Treaty, because for the Falkland War, for example, different countries asking to use this treaty, do you think that is obsolete or do you need another one? Is it possible to write another defense agreement like the Rio Treaty?
Well, this is only a personal view, but I would say that not only this treaty, but others that were, well, this one is older actually, but many treaties that back up the international cooperation or security in the region are back in the 1990s.
40s, yes, 40s.
1990s. We are 34 years from there. Things have changed a lot. We are facing new security challenges. We are also trying to manage how we are going to use technology in order to face new challenges. We are facing misinformation, and I won't say that they are obsolete, but I would say that we need reflection. We need to reflect on the documents. We need to reflect on the mechanisms that we have. And for that, we need dialogue. And dialogue is just key to see what is actually working and what is not, and what possibilities we have to change things in order to be better.
You say technology, Commodore, in US. What is the role of advanced technology like unmanned system or artificial intelligence? What the play role in the technology in today and in the future?
Sorry, I was very impressed by that shift there. It's straight from, I was going to talk about the Rio Treaty in 47 and then some others, but I'm glad you shifted it to something that is more military. I was trying to prepare, how can I talk about the Rio Treaty? So from, and again, looking at it from a Southcom lens and a broader high-end capability perspective, I think the key point about emerging technologies in general, if you were to look at both the US and then some of the other nations who have had a significant commitment, we're still a long way from success, and that's with billions of dollars invested into it. So this is not an overnight fix. I would suggest that one of the benefits of the Ukraine conflict to the broader military community is our advancement in procurement times, so the reduction in them significantly to ensure that capability gets to the user at time of crisis and at time of need. So what we're seeing now is the benefit coming global to those nations where we have emerging technologies being used without fear of failure in areas across the globe to then determine the broader utility in the longer term. So if we look at autonomous systems in general, from a Southern Command, General Richardson is very clear that her area of responsibility in all domains, surface, subsurface, air and space, where it is open, where it's non-territorial, it's an open environment, it's a benign environment, it's permissive, and it allows us to test technologies at pace in order to determine their utility. And if one of the key points from a military perspective is understanding the needs of the customer, and that customer in every sense is different, and their utility. But if we were looking for common themes throughout Latin America, domain awareness is one that is consistent. And if we're looking at the maritime domain awareness, what US Southern Command have done with the benefits of the experience in the Middle East from what was Task Force 5-9, so that's 5th Fleet Area of Operations out of Central Command. 5-9 is a task force who have been employing technologies in an operational theatre to the benefit of the wider DoD community. So 5-9's successes are now being replicated in some senses. There's no task forces formed, but each of the component commands have the opportunity within their organization to get after some of the use of emerging technologies to meet the capability shortfalls, but it comes at a cost. And I think if you were honest in Latin America and the Caribbean, every nation is different. There is no two nations the same, and their requirements are different. So we need to consider how we would utilize some of those capabilities. And I think if you're honest, again, we struggle right now with basic communications. So until we master some of these areas, we need to then focus on how we employ it in the longer term.
Yeah, but for example, in Singapore and Europe, they have an information fusion center that is for the maritime domain awareness.
Absolutely.
Do you think that it's possible using this technology and improve the relationship between the countries in the region using this kind of information fusion center?
Yeah, and I'd say it's happening already, and I think this is a role, from a military perspective, is in Latin America and the Caribbean in particular. If we look at the range of security threats, the military are supporting in many senses. So we're not supported. There's no operations, and well, minimal, but most of them are contingency. That means that we are supporting other agencies. So it's a truly interagency approach, and appreciating the military part in it. And events and organizations such as RUSI, such as the Perry Center, who we work very closely with, and FIU with Brian and Randy, you know, the reliance on those organizations so that we have that level of independence and we have evidence-based approaches has led us to a product which is enhanced domain awareness. So an element sponsored by Southern Command, but the product is delivered by FIU. And that product is then available. So it's basically, if you were in the simplest of terms, it's a management of a massive amount of information, and then the customer, each of those nations, with controlled access, is able to filter and manage the information they need. So we're working on it at the relatively lower level, but it's a significant step forward through the use of technology in order to deliver it to the customer. Yeah,
this is the military view, but what's happening with the civilian view from Washington again, Paul?
So on this point, I would say that you know, we're very much in alignment in Washington, D.C. The interagency process is something that has been refined over the past 20 years, 20, 30 years in Washington, D.C. And I've worked at 3 different embassies abroad. And what I find most rewarding is that every time I go for a new posting, there's greater interagency integration among the United States, and then greater bilateral integration with partner or analogous institutions in the host nation. When you're looking at the challenges posed by emerging technologies, and particularly AI, I think there are opportunities for our adversaries to exploit, because we are going into this unprepared. As I was having a conversation yesterday with Randy, I mean, we have to be right 100% of the time. They have to be right just once. In terms of our adversaries. And that's the real challenge when trying to build out a cyber defense capability. And getting back to, broadly speaking, governance issues in cyberspace, if we look across Latin America and the Caribbean, civilian governments are woefully underprepared in terms of the kinds of regulations, laws that govern cyberspace. Countries like Panama, for instance, it's the most digitally connected country in Latin America, has significant critical infrastructure. Airport is a huge hub, obviously the Panama Canal, financial sector there. It's a country that as well lacks any real legal structure for dealing with the kinds of crimes that could be committed within cyberspace, or the kinds of crimes that would degrade the country's critical infrastructure. To that point, I would bring up another example, which is the Vice President of the United States. She has recently sought to corral the democratic and other nations of the world in signing a political declaration on the responsible military use of AI. To date, I believe the document has 47 signatories. Not a single signatory to the document is from Latin America and the Caribbean. Which goes to show how far behind the region actually is in being prepared for the kinds of threats that it's confronting. A region that, on average is getting millions of cyber attacks a day.
Yeah, Victoria, before the panel we was talking about the technology. Indeed, it's not my area. We are not talking about the technology, but do you think that the technology can help you in your job, and especially with stabilization?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of examples I'd flag more on the serious and organized crime side is I think that emerging technologies are proving to have a whole kind of set of really interesting opportunities. When we look at monitoring illegal gold mining or monitoring other forms of illegal mining, technology is really a brilliant tool that's enhancing our capability to identify where the problem is in a kind of less interventionist manner and be able to kind of target and invest kind of practical solutions in countries that are absolutely enormous. You know, when we think about the context of Brazil, technologies are of fundamental importance in order to make sure that we safeguard the necessary resources required to tackle these forms of serious organized crime. I'd kind of highlight what Paul said as well. I think there's a tendency, understandably, to kind of focus on the kind of emerging technology because I think it's incredibly exciting and interesting and we're at kind of the cutting edge. But I would absolutely agree that actually going back to kind of basics and basic kind of governance structures, legislation, and the fundamentals of cyber, if we look at the Colombian context, the recent hack and the recent leak from the Attorney General's office and the kind of ripple effect that had in terms of identifying several, DEA, US agents, and the kind of ripple effect that has on our ability to tackle serious organized crime, the country's stability, the conflict dynamics at play. I think with technology, yes, lots and lots of really exciting opportunities that we should absolutely be kind of capitalizing on and working with our kind of Latin American counterparts to upskill and to focus on. However, I also think my caution would be kind of to go back to the basic foundations in addition.
No, great. Paul, I was reading that the Pew Center is writing some papers about the climate change. And do you think that the climate change play a role in this defense cooperation?
Yeah, as I mentioned in my initial remarks, the Perry Center has built out an entire line of effort with dedicated resources to helping the countries of the Americas deal with the looming threats and the negative effects of climate change. I think at the level of the Department of Defense, we've gone from a place 10 years ago during the Obama administration where the National Defense Strategy identified climate change as a threat multiplier to a place where under the current administration in the National Defense Strategy that was published in 2022, Secretary Austin describes climate change as an existential threat and perhaps the most important threat that we confront as a nation. And so what we look to do at the Perry Center is help, we collate best practices from around the globe to help ministries of defense and security do long-range planning and budgeting for the effects of climate change. As you mentioned, I sit on the board of visitors for the U.S. Naval Academy, and a lot of the conversations that we have in those board meetings have to do with the fact that the Naval Academy sits at or below the level of the Severn River in the Chesapeake Bay on which it sits. So the Naval Academy is the first Department of Navy installation that has a 70-year climate resiliency plan that we like to model for the students in our climate change implications for defense and security course to show them a way for how a country and how an installation and how an institution like a Ministry of Defense can take into account the externalities that are posed by climate change, which will most certainly, if not addressed in a preventive way, create demographic displacement, migration, cross-border criminal opportunities for cross-border criminality, resource competition. We're already starting to see these dynamics play out in Latin America and the Caribbean, particularly in the Caribbean and Central America today, but these effects stand to only worsen in the decades to come.
Thank you. What is the view from Miami, Florida?
Miami, the capital of Latin America, as some say. So, you know, in Southern Command previously, so Southern Command just over 60 years old, and previously based in Panama, relocated to Miami for the appropriate reasons, and ultimately just because we're in Miami, the access we have to the whole of Latin America and the demographic is critical. So we understand and we're close, and the proximity matters in that respect. So on climate change, Paul had rightfully highlighted Secretary of Defense Austin's directives are very clear, and this environment in particular in Latin America and the Caribbean it is of critical importance. Everything from Antarctica north, and with just over 20 years until we renew treaties in Antarctica, it's of significant importance. So climate security is an absolute focus for Southern Command, and the military contribution towards, because again it is a contribution in those areas. And I think what we're dealing with in many respects is trying to understand the consequences and trying to get ahead of the Antarctic issues. We've seen a considerable focus on Arctic with the treaties and announcements and access in general. So how does that impact on, if we were to turn the map from a truly polar sense, to understand the consequence on the global aspect? And I would highlight that from Southern Command, although there is not a few formal treaties as such, so the alliances, but one of the key alliances are the three regional security conferences that General Richardson holds on an annual basis. So there is Central American Security Conference, Caribbean Security Conference, and Southern American Security Conference, CENTSEC, CANSEC, SOUTHDEC. And at each of those conferences, all of those nations participate. So the chiefs of defense, the ministers of the host nations, academia playing a critical role in many senses in moderating. And the topics consistently are on climate security. So if we look at those key topics, climate security and cyber security, and coming back to some of the points on cyber security and education, and that's critical from our own experiences and our capabilities as those key Western nations, to ensure that cyber hygiene and the basics is administered to avoid some of the issues that we have elsewhere. So it's trying to come back truly to a bottom-up approach before we go to the high-end capabilities. So it's almost that gradual adjustment is necessary, but focusing on what the priorities are. And coming back to that, climate security is absolutely one of those priorities.
And Karen, is a priority for your talk with another Minister of Defense? The climate change is one of the top priorities, or is just start talking about this issue in your conversations?
It is a key topic, as it is also for the whole government. You know that Chile is, according to the United Nations, one of the countries that are most vulnerable to climate change, and we do also have natural disasters such as floods or tsunamis, and so we really need to work in order to build resilience. And of course, defense has a role in the whole system. We are not the main actors. This is more civilian, but the militaries are also supporting the whole system. And we need to look at this climate change from two sides perspective, maybe. Climate change is a threat enhancer, and we are clear about it. But also, it is a strategic variable in planning and operational capabilities. So we need to have that in mind too. And I think that maybe we have had some difficult moments in the last 2 years. We have wildfires at the beginning of last year, and we have also flooding in the middle of the year, last year. And those are some good examples of how international cooperation works. Actually, during the wildfires, we have cooperation from other countries. I remember at least 5 countries that were present in Chile fighting against the fire side to side with all the agencies involved in this, because this is absolutely interagency. This is not only military. So this is a key issue in which international cooperations work, and it is sad at the same time, because we know that every year we're going to have problems, and this is not only Chile, this is the whole region, actually.
It's a problem.
It's a
Thank you,
problem,
Karen.
yes.
We have another question talking about China and Bukele. We can talking about defense, security, if not talking about Bukele effect. But we keep this question for the next round. But I want to offer to you a question for the audience. Please raise your hand and ask which one of the panel, please, gentlemen. Yes. Your name and institution, please.
My name is Angelo,
Lower, please. Sorry.
Basically, I want to find out, we talked about climate change in Latin America, and I'm also talking about the challenging effects. Modern conflict nature because of urbanization and migration. So what are some of the defense cooperation that are taking place and the doctrines associated with military in terms of the changing nature of warfare and migration issue and urbanization? Thank you.
Great question. Thank you very much. Paul, you can.
So I think the view of the U.S. Southern Command, frankly, is that the Department of Defense plays a supporting role in addressing the migration challenges that the Americas confront today. We've not seen a wave of migration in the Americas this large and this multicultural ever. I don't know more recent statistics, but a report that I wrote 3 or 4 years ago about Central America, in the Darien Gap, there were identified in, I think, 2021, 121 different nationalities that were passing through the Darien Gap in a given year, which suggests that it's not just a regional crisis, it's a global crisis of displacement. And to that end, I think we should be recurring to global mechanisms. The lead for dealing with the regional migration crisis from the U.S. government is the Department of Homeland Security, with close coordination with our various bureaus at the Department of State. But in terms of defense coordination, really the Defense Department is best equipped for corralling cooperation where humanitarian assistance is most needed. Those are the capabilities that I think the Department of Defense can bring to bear in a scenario where there's major demographic displacement and where people's rights are being violated routinely because of the conditions in which they find themselves as they seek to transit the very ungovernable areas of Latin America.
Yeah. Any plans in SOUTHCOM about?
Well, yeah. Yes, there are, naturally. But and ultimately, I think coming back to the point about the weaponization, the changing character of conflict, and what does it mean from a migration perspective? Migration has been centuries old, and it will not change. The sad reality from a Latin America Caribbean is, as Paul alludes to, it's not just within Latin America and the Caribbean, it's in every direction. If we're looking at Far Eastern, Middle Eastern, African, European migrants coming into Latin America and then making their way to the US, and I think it's trying to, from a military perspective, it's trying to understand the threat thoroughly and support, as Paul says rightfully, Department of Homeland Security, the lead, military from an intelligence perspective supporting, from an understand perspective supporting, and then the concerns from not just through the Darien region and ultimately, Venezuela down to Chile and Chile north again, and routes that are being exploited through some criminal organizations in support of. It's the other aspects of the situation in Haiti and the mass migration situation, Cuba deteriorating situation, what happens to those individuals, and being sympathetic to legal migration versus illegal migration and understanding where we can actually support it on the situation. The situation is not improving, regardless of the resource and capacity that goes towards it. The reality is we understand it more. Over the Darien region, over 500,000 migrants last year alone, significant increases, but that's what we know. We only know what we know in this case, so those are the facts in that sense. So yes, there are plans, naturally, in support of other government departments that would lead those efforts, and we continue to expend considerable bandwidth on that issue.
I think the issue of military intelligence, both in the context of migration but other forms of kind of transnational threats linked into conflict, is a really thorny and tricky one, because what we often see is a kind of a whole set of risks brought to communities who are put in the position to provide said intelligence, which is then acted upon, and then kind of retributions are sought. So I think there's that cooperation that colleagues have mentioned already around the kind of humanitarian and defense, and the weighting and the proportion of that, depending on the specific dynamics and the different crises that we're seeing, and being kind of very mindful of potential retributions, potential safeguarding risks, and implications on said communities that we are kind of collectively trying to protect from different angles.
I think, and apologies for the use of intelligence from a military sense, I think the key, especially in a benign environment where we're working, the majority of it is either open source information, and it's collected by a group of analysts who are supporting other efforts. This is not targeting information that you would use in a generic term of military operations. So it's using all sources, all sensors, all capabilities, industry and others, in order to provide a product that better understands the issue and therefore gives us collectively something to act upon rather than targeted military intelligence. For the record.
For the record, thank you very much. Sir, please. Bianca? The gentleman.
Thank you. Ewan Grant, former law enforcement intelligence analyst. I've never worked in the Caribbean or South America, though I have had many colleagues who have. But my links are indirect through particularly my work in Ukraine and the Balkans, but above all in Ukraine.
Yeah.
My question follows from that. Elephant in the room, Cuba and Venezuela. What cooperation, if any, is there on what? And more importantly, where does the trail go cold? Thank you.
Thank you. Commodore.
Thank you. Yeah.
Open the fire.
So and Minister Heapy was clear this morning when it comes to, we'll talk on the record, we'll talk about information. So I will give you the Google search answer in that sense. And I think, so it is clear there are cooperations in many areas. Of the 31 countries that are within SOUTHCOM's area of responsibility, 3 are deemed ultimately as non-democratic, both Venezuela, Colombia, Nicaragua, Cuba. Sorry, did I say Colombia? That was far from it. Colombia. On the record again, Cuba.
Delayed from the record, please.
So there are connections naturally, and again through open source information, you will look at where our adversaries and those state actors are using that influence and relationship, so the Russias, the Chinas and Irans, to greater effect. And this comes back to proximity. So Cuba in particular being the closest point to southern Florida and to mainland US at risk, and therefore the use of Cuba by others in order to hit at the homeland in many respects is a considerable threat and a considerable risk, and therefore something that requires close attention. And Minister Heapy mentioned this morning about the first and second island chains, and Admiral Craig Fowler, as a previous SOUTHCOM commander, had some open source work done again on replicating what we would see on a map in the South China Seas with the first and second island chains, and replicating that into the Caribbean and into Colombia, one of our closest friends and allies in that region, to see where the threats are. And ultimately, if you look at all 3 countries, then Cuba and Venezuela in this case are very much inside that and are being used by others in order to increase the security risk to the regional partners.
Yeah. Paul?
On the issue of looking at the 3 countries that are undemocratic, solidly undemocratic, where the United States doesn't really enjoy robust cooperation arrangements, there are, at least in the case of Cuba, that's one I can speak to, we do have U.S. law enforcement officials who work out of our embassy in Havana, a Coast Guard representative, to work on transnational legal issues with the Cubans. There are some areas where there may be a confluence of interests, and so there is limited interaction to the extent that that is the case. But broadly speaking, and I bring up the other elephant in the room, which is the movement that we've made in recent years towards strategic competition with near-peer adversaries like China and Russia and Latin America and the Caribbean. the view of the United States, as was reiterated in the previous panel, that the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean can enjoy economic relationships and arrangements with whomever they like, but when those economic arrangements start to impede or impinge on democratic governance considerations, that's where we see cause for great concern.
Yeah.
And if you look at the history of, in sort of strategic terms, we talk about denial, strategic denial of near-peer adversaries operating in Latin America and the Caribbean and undermining U.S. interests, undermining the democratic consensus of the region. The United States, for the last 30 or 40 years, really hasn't had much to worry about. It's been a region that's been largely peaceful. China and Russia were kind of late to the game in terms of engaging Latin America in relation to other regions of the global south. In fact, Latin America was the last region of the world to sign on to the Belt and Road Initiative.
The last one.
And so I think now we're in a scenario where, as was mentioned in the previous panel as well, most of the countries of South America have more robust economic relations with China than they do with their neighbors and with the United States. And we're going to start to have to compete for affection that we may have taken for granted for too long. But the one thing that I think, a place where I feel that the United States remains the premier partner for the countries of Latin America is in the security and defense space. It's an area where, firstly, Beijing is not especially well equipped to engage. Secondarily, where I think our partners across Latin America and the Caribbean are rightfully suspicious of the kinds of technology that China seeks to offload on the region. But thirdly, a place where the United States and like-minded partners, and particularly the countries of Europe, really have a lot of credibility on dealing with security and defense issues, and particularly technology, and the respectful integration of information sharing, et cetera. And that is something that should not be taken for granted, and I think is the strategic advantage that we currently enjoy.
I told you I have China for the next round because China is an issue in the Latin America. Juan Pablo?
Thanks. You mentioned many fields to expand the cooperations in matters of defense, as artificial intelligence, climate change, etc. But what about of space? Because there's a lot of facilities in Latin America to track satellites or track communications. There are facilities, China is operating facilities in Bolivia and in Argentina.
Bolivia.
Also, I've been in Antarctica last week, so there's many facilities in Antarctica that could be used for track satellites or for use, military and civilian use, and you can basically, you can know what is going on inside these facilities.
You can say no, it's not only for civilian or for military.
Yeah, it's a black box for many of us, for many countries. So what is important of space in terms of defense cooperation in Latin America? Because it looks like there's a new field. Thank you.
Steve.
Back in. So from a, and again, from a Southern Command perspective, a considerable amount of effort is placed in the space domain, naturally. When I mentioned earlier, the 7 combatant commands, Space Command is one. So within Southern Command, we work closely with Space Command in the opportunities, the risks, the threats, and understanding where we are. So Latin America and the Caribbean very much so, as you mentioned. There are, you could look at Argentina with Neuquén Province and a variety of others where there's facilities that are already enabled, Chilean space program improving. So there are opportunities to educate. There's opportunity on the risks that are associated with it for dual purpose in particular. And ultimately looking for the understanding of the low Earth orbit and Antarctic access and a variety of others, and ensuring that we are working closely with the partners. And one of the key areas is in governance in general. So trying to understand the governance aspect of it and ultimately the consequences of it. So space is not ignored by any means of the imagination. And again, the conferences that we have regularly and the exercises that are conducted annually it absolutely contributes to it. And again, that's purely from a military contribution to the wider space efforts. And General Richardson traveling into the region in particular, she's in Ecuador right now, and we've moved in the last 2 years to a truly interagency approach to key leader engagement, both ministerial in the policy domain and then into the military through the chiefs of defense. And recent visits have included the NASA director, where appropriate, and other visits will include commerce for some of the economic aspects, and where necessary, security departments and others. So that's where, as a collective, trying to move forwards. And one event next week in Southern Command is the annual Space Conference of the Americas, again, bringing together the key individuals, the stakeholders, again, to inform, to educate, to understand, and then determine where we can collectively support the needs of the host nation where necessary.
Thank you. Karen?
Well, yes, thank you, Juan Pablo, because I think this is one of the areas in which international cooperations can grow a lot. We are just starting in this area, I mean the Latin American region. There are some very interesting initiatives already going on in the region, within the region, from a multilateral perspective, but also in a more bilateral stance. We are also working with extra-regional partners, of course. And this is something we, and again, this is a personal view, is something that we need to put in the highest level of discussions. Security conferences and also all the ministers' meetings must have space in their talking. But in this area, we cannot forget that space is not only military, it's interagency too.
It's open.
So it's not only an issue of defense, and therefore there are other agencies and there are other entities that must be in the arena. In some countries, actually, defense is not the main actor. So we need to be aware of those differences in order to talk about this further.
Yeah, but Paul, we watched a video on a session of the US Congress when one of the congressmen called the Secretary of Defense or something like that, asking about what's happening in Argentina. Which one is the regulation about this China base in Argentina using satellites without any information to the other part of the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the big challenge with Espacio Lejano in Argentina is really that it's, the Argentinians don't even know what's happening on the facility within their own national territory. And so it's much harder for the rest of us to know what's going on. And there I think you see where there are real risks in terms of violations of national sovereignty when the terms and conditions of an agreement between two nations aren't clearly spelled out and aren't negotiated in transparent ways. I think one of the more promising turns regionally on space in recent years has been the fact that many of the countries of the region have signed on to the Artemis Accords, which represent dedication to peaceful, cooperative exploration of space, and it's a first step in terms of governing what all of us know as the final frontier. And so I would offer that there's growing interest in space amongst the countries of particularly South America, and there's a lot more that we can be doing. And in fact, at the Perry Center right now, we're working with one of our principal partners in the region, Brazil, on seeing how we can coordinate together to triangulate messaging on the responsible use and protection of space and space equities.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. Juan?
My name is Leopoldo Lopez. I'm from Venezuela, currently a fellow at the Wilson Center. And my question is about a scenario of possible transition in Venezuela. What would be the greatest challenge in terms of transitioning the actual military that is completely dependent on Russia since 2007? It shifted completely from a US, European cooperation, equipment, towards completely Russian-centric. So what would you see as the short-term challenges of that transition in the military sector?
Paul?
Thank you, Leopoldo. It's great to see you again. I think, honestly, the normalization of corruption and malfeasance will be the most significant short-term and long-term challenge for post-transition Venezuela. Maduro has instrumentalized the security forces in the country by giving them governance roles, making their survival and his survival so interlinked that they continue to support him against even their own best interests, and when given favorable off-ramps to do the right thing. And so even if we do get to a point in the short term in which there is a political transition in Venezuela, which was something that we're all hoping for, the military will continue to be a spoiler because it currently exists in an ecosystem in which corruption is the operating model. And those old habits die hard. And it went from being a highly professional and highly capable military and a good partner to the United States just 20 years ago to being a kleptocratic and nepotistic organization that has, in many ways, served only the interests of organized crime and adversaries, global adversaries that don't have the best interests of everyday Venezuelans at heart.
Thank you. China and Venezuela, always present. Please, gentlemen.
Pedro Ureli, I'm also from Venezuela, and I'd like to follow up. This was a narrow question. I think it's a broader question. We're talking about defense cooperation, and we were talking about democratic backsliding, we're talking about transnational crime, and we're talking about the presence in the region of external state players. What do you actually see in this scenario of a transition that is a requirement in order to guarantee that transition can actually occur, given the state of play and the players on the ground? Put it in the context both of Plan Colombia, which worked but took a very long time, and of the failure, of, as you said, of the Meier initiative. And I'd like to posit that what we're seeing in Ecuador is just by child's play to the challenges that an incoming administration would face in Venezuela, because it's much more complex, it's much deeper, and it is not the state that has been looking sideways at a problem, it's that the state has been deeply involved in criminal activities. So dislodging them and cleaning up, the role of criminal gangs, transnational crime organizations and cartels, and obviously the appetite of foreign state, non-Western, non-hemispheric state actors would be very difficult. In terms of planning, and let's put a scenario where I wouldn't put any probability to the scenario, but let's say there are elections, which is what everybody seems to be calling as a solution to a problem. At times I laugh because that's not the problem, but we're trying to solve a problem with elections. Let's assume we do solve it with elections, and there is that change. Are you guys ready? And I'm talking directly to the people who work from the US and the UK that actually understand deeply the nature of the problem in Venezuela. Are we ready?
Thank you. Thank you for your question.
So, I think we'd have to look to Venezuela as we would with any stabilization mission that the United States government has undertaken in the last 20 years. There are the most salient examples would be Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, and Ukraine, none of which were, with the exception of possibly of Ukraine, were resounding successes. But you do point to one instance of stabilization, although it was not stabilization by occupation, Plan Colombia, where I think there are some very valuable lessons for a post-transition Venezuela. And in that regard, I think one of the most significant efforts on part of the United States and Colombian partners was investment in specific units that were very specialized, that served, they were vetted units, they were specially trained, and they were, for the most part, removed from the rest of the organization, in this case the Colombian military, the Colombian National Police, because they didn't want these institutions or these units within these institutions to be as susceptible to corruption as other units had become. And those units, a counter-narcotics battalion in Colombia and in various parts of the South, became the nucleus for a much broader institutional transformation. And so I think that's a place where you could start. Some of the other lessons that I tease out in my book have to do with the fact that no external actor, whether it's the United States or another country, the European Union, is going to actually underwrite this whole transformation of Venezuelan society. Venezuelans, whether they're in Venezuela or whether they represent Venezuelan diaspora across the world, are going to have to find financial mechanisms to ensure that any international support that goes towards reforming the security forces and stabilizing the country is actually sustainable. There has to be national buy-in. We got that in Colombia in the form of a democratic security tax, which gave the Colombian Minister of Defense unprecedented resources to do what he or she, in the case of Marta Lucia, had to do over 10 to 15 years, and it worked. In Mexico, there are a couple of subnational cases where the private sector played an incredibly pivotal role in turning the dial in the right direction on the organized crime fight. There I would point to Ciudad Juarez and Monterrey. Again, both instances where the private sector got together and applied a tax that extended or enlarged the resources that local governments had to reform police, to engage in community policing, to invest in community infrastructure, and to go after criminal actors who are operating in their cities and states. And then, finally, I think one of the real opportunities in refashioning or revamping security forces in a post-transition Venezuela would be to centralize decision-making. What we notice in Mexico is a country that has 1,800 plus police forces at 3 levels of government, a divided Ministry of Defense. So it has a secretariat for the Army and the Air Force, and then a secretariat for the Navy. There are no coordination, very scant coordination amongst the various institutions that have equities in the security and defense space. And it makes it very, very difficult for them to act together, to share information, because there are jealousies, whether those are jealousies over budgets or promotions or whatever. But secondarily, the more institutions you have, the more nodes you have for state capture. And this is what we see at the subnational level in Mexico, despite the fact that the federal forces may be implementing a plan and a strategy in attractive territory that shows great promise. More often than not, there are subnational actors who have state legitimacy because they represent elected officials and elected police commissioners in local police forces that have engaged in back-channel negotiations with organized crime. And so those are some broad reflections that I think would have specific applicability to Venezuela if we get to a point where we have a return to democracy and stabilization is on the table.
Thank you, Paul. I would like to hear your point of view from OSCM.
OCSM, yes, it's a bit of a tongue twister. So I completely agree with Paul. A couple of Paul's points, particularly around private sector and opportunities around there, and the role of external actors, and being really pragmatic and honest about our space and ability, space to operate and ability to influence. I think that's the first thing. That from a UK perspective, obviously the US is a very different dynamic, but from a UK perspective, I think we'd have to take a really realistic and pragmatic take on how, the space we'd have to operate and the level of influence we'd have. We'd absolutely stand to support and contribute our partners. And then linked to that, you mentioned Colombia. I think, if we think about...
That was me that mentioned Colombia.
Oh, sorry. Well, I think if we think about, the problem of the ELN and armed groups and the crossing of armed groups across the border with Venezuela, armed groups and organized crime don't respect national borders. They don't respect the law. Why would they respect borders? So I think thinking about these challenges in relation to kind of Colombia's neighbors and the role that the international community and external actors can play in facilitating and strengthening transnational kind of responses, and thinking about, the Colombian peace process and how that will impact stabilization equities in Venezuela, I think is a fundamental problem. And I think if we don't address the challenge around ELN, we can't start thinking about peace in either, and full kind of peace and full stabilization in either of those contexts.
Yeah, another point of view. Thank you very much, Victoria.
I think to add, to try and get to a relatively simple answer to your question, Ambassador, and this is a personal opinion, based in Miami, understanding the Venezuela situation as best I can. My landlady lives in Caracas. My neighbor was incarcerated for 2.5 years in a Caracas prison as the chief of staff to Juan Guaido. So we have a community within Miami that provides us with as much of an understanding of the situation as possible. I think if we connect the dots and look at it from a military perspective, your question was, how ready are we for a transition? It comes back to likelihood. you know, the likelihood right now for free, fair elections, as you mentioned, and then a transition from the criminality element of it, the interconnectedness with transnational criminal organizations, Maduro's rhetoric on Essequibo region, and some of the other situations, and as you mentioned, Russian influence for decades, Iranian influence continues significantly. So it's trying to put it into perspective of ensuring from a military perspective that those on-the-shelf plans are tuned to the point of where how likely is a transition right now. And I think if we're honest, it's unlikely as the situation stands. That's not to say we're not doing everything we can to support it and embrace it, but that's a position we're in right now. So how can we collectively, truly interagency and truly global, try and get us in a position where the people of Venezuela get what they have been asking for a long time.
Thank you. Kate, please. A lady. You are minority, Kate, please.
Thank you. My name is Kate Smith from Babcock, UK defence industry. So apologies, I want to change the subject rather, but go back to Juan Pablo's reference to Antarctica in relation to space. I wanted to ask about Antarctica itself and ask the panel about the current or future potential scope of defence cooperation in view of, again, potential geopolitical competition around Antarctica.
Wow, a different question. Karen.
Closest to Antarctica.
You are close to the Antarctic.
That's true. Yes, well, yes, Chile is the closest country to
the question
Antarctica,
is very
that's
important
right.
because talking
Absolutely.
about the cooperation.
Yes. First of all, I will highlight that there is international cooperation already in place in Antarctica. I'm not getting into the strategic competition yet in my answer, but it is interesting to see there is a lot of international cooperations in terms of logistics and operational stance for Chile, and following the Antarctic Treaty. We see Antarctica as a place for scientific cooperation and scientific activities, but the 80% of the activities that we do in Antarctica depends on the logistics that are provided by the armed forces.
Especially the Navy.
Especially the Navy, well, yes.
Of course.
So, and we do support other international programs in their own missions in Antarctica, and that is a daily basis activity. And by now, this is a personal view, I don't clearly see how this is going to change in the near future. Maybe if we talk in more a long-term future, closer maybe to this year of probably the revision of the treaty, things are going to be a little bit more complicated, but by now I don't see that changing. We see and we observe and we are always aware of what is going on in the areas around Antarctica. There is a lot of things going on there, and we do actually have responsibilities in terms of search and rescue, maritime domain, and we do have to cooperate in that sense too with other countries, and we do so. That's why what Kate can add by now.
Yeah, Kate, I think so. From Minister Heapy mentioned this morning about southern blindness that was raised by Admiral Craig Fowler about 3 years ago. And one of the reasons for Admiral Fowler raising that was to go back to DC. It wasn't for any other audience initially. It was to ensure that they understood where we hadn't ignored, that's unfair, but collectively the focus was in that central area, Caribbean naturally, and then through Colombia, across Brazil, and pretty much lots of those areas south of that weren't getting the attention that they absolutely deserved. So what we're trying to do now is to re-energize that as much as possible in order to build the understanding of Antarctica on some of those opportunities that comes with it. But I think one of the keys for us with the allied integration, the framework for Western Hemisphere allied collaboration, is you have to look at it on a polar map. No, there's no point looking at it north-south. Turn the map around and go on a polar map, and you will start to see Australia, New Zealand, a variety of others who have an interest and who have access. So we're trying to progress that from our domain, and that's only one small part, because again, it's much, much wider than that, but it's understanding the risk and opportunities associated with it, and again, not trying to act in a small group. This is global.
Yeah, this is global. I have time for one more question, please.
You've talked about...
I'm sorry, your name and...
My name's Luke. I'm a researcher in terms of humanitarian operations. You've talked about migration in Latin America. You've talked about how it's a global issue as well. What lessons can we learn about how Latin America treats migration very differently to how Europe treats migration coming from the Middle East?
Paul.
So I, in a previous life, worked briefly at the U.S. Embassy in Honduras, and at the time it was during the Obama administration, at the height of the child migrant crisis, which in today's terms, we're dealing with the child migrant crisis every day, all day. It's interesting to note that when we were confronting a crisis in the 2013 to 2016 timeframe at the U.S. southern border, it was actually the lowest flow of irregular migrants in the past 20 years coming from Latin America and the Caribbean to the United States. And during that time, I quickly came to appreciate that our partners in many Latin American countries, and particularly in Central America, view migration as a human right. But on the same token, don't deal with the fact that the human rights of migrants are being consistently and systematically violated as migrants are transiting the Central American isthmus to make it to either Mexico or the United States. And so it's viewed as a human right because in many countries that are resource-strapped where the tax bases are incredibly low, in fact, the countries of Central America have among the lowest effective tax rates of any country in the world, it's easy to just say that something is a human right and turn a blind eye to the fact that all kinds of trafficking activities, both north and south, are happening in your national territory. It's much more difficult to throw resources behind dealing with migration as also a criminal and security issue. And to that extent, I think we have to look at regional cooperation mechanisms. The U.S. Department of State and Department of Homeland Security is right now coordinated with several countries in the region to serve as migration hubs, or particularly hubs for people to apply for asylum. Colombia and Costa Rica are two examples where individuals who are seeking asylum in the United States, instead of having to make a treacherous journey through the Darien or through the Central America or across the Mexico-Guatemala border, can go to facilities in region to apply for asylum, to ensure that those who are the best candidates for asylum can actually apply and then make it to the United States in a safe manner, or make it to a third country where their rights will be protected in a safe manner. But right now, we're woefully underserving migrants and the countries in the region by not cooperating and ensuring that we're aligning resources to deal with the challenge.
Thank you. Okay, I think that we are time for lunch, and we can continue the talking during the lunch. So thank you very much for all the questions. Please join me to say thank you, panel.